All right. Good morning. Welcome to Ask the Agronomist here on a dreary late November morning. Apologize for the confusion we had last week. So, if you logged in last week expecting last week to be Ask the Agronomist, that would have been our normal cadence. And we neglected to remove the invite for last week when we, 2 weeks before that, decided to wait 3 weeks to get so we didn't land on Thanksgiving and to avoid a meeting that we all had here at Bear last Thursday. That was a technical meeting that I needed to participate in. So anyway, if you were here last week wondering where the hell we were, I apologize for that. We'll try to be better at that in the future. And I'm here by myself in the Monmouth studios this morning. Heather has a flurry of appointments this morning that she has to be at, so she's not here to hold my hand, which I'm terribly sad about, and really worried about getting through this episode without her sitting here in front of me, providing support and inspiration. But we'll make the best of it. So you're here for support and inspiration, and I appreciate that. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. Hopefully, we get some questions today. I've got a bit of a list here that I've been making, and one thing I had hoped to share with you today that I regret I'm not able to share with you today, and we may do that 2 weeks from now, hopefully. I had a little problem last night when I went to analyze my row spacing yield data from soybeans. And I've got some good data. I think it's going to be interesting. I have a hunch what it's going to say. I'm not going to share that hunch here this morning. Well, actually, I might, but we'll see as we get into it, because it actually relates to what I was going to talk about today. And today's going to be kind of soybean heavy. Now, we all know corn's our favorite, right? And it's really easy to talk about corn and forget soybeans sometimes. We're going to be soybean focused here today. However, if you want to derail the soybean focus and get back on your favorite crop of corn, all you got to do is ask a question about corn, and we'll take 20 minutes talking about corn and forget all about soybeans like we normally do. But this is all soybean stuff here. So I guess I'm gonna start with the premise that some of you raised phenomenally good soybeans in 25. Some of you did not. So soybean yields were variable, which variable yields are normal. If we ever have a year where yields are not variable, that would be really weird. So there were beans that struggled to make 60. There were beans that were over 90. And, if you had some of the ones that struggled to make 60, you don't want to hear about somebody else's making 90. And if your beans made 90, you're probably surprised to find out that some people had beans that barely made 60. So, the difference between 60 and 90 is, pretty dramatic, obviously. Has a big impact on your profitability. Has a big impact on your pride and how you feel about yourself as a soybean producer, and probably has a big impact on how happy you are with your seed supplier, and the kind of conversations you're having with your seed supplier. Now, your seed supplier may not have a damn thing to do with why your beans only made 60, or frankly, why your beans made 90. That probably has more to do with the weather and your management than it does where you buy your beans, just to be truthfully blunt about it. Because I've seen some beans that aren't very good make 100, and I've seen soybeans that are outstanding make 50. So there's lots of mystery, lots of confusion, lots of frustration around what drives yield in soybeans. How and I think most farmers feel. I've always argued this a little bit. I think guys are generally more comfortable that they understand corn, and soybeans frustrate and confuse them because you never know what they're going to make. They almost never make what you thought they were going to make. They're either worse than you thought or better than you thought. they seem unpredictable. I, I don't know that they're that much more variable and unpredictable than corn, because when your corn you thought was going to make 300 makes 200, that's kind of a surprise, and it's a third different than what you thought. And when your soybeans that you thought were going to make 90 make 60, that's also a third different than you thought. So I don't know. I think we sometimes think soybeans are a lot different than corn, and to me, both crops are highly variable, responsive to management, responsive to weather, responsive to lots of things that happen to them, and yields can range from awful to disappointing to satisfying to amazing in both crops. And like most years, I've talked to people that experienced all four of those different yield levels in both crops this year. All the way from disappointing, bad would be the worst category. So I've had guys that were pretty damn disappointed and pretty damn irritated at a yield that wasn't that damn bad, but it was disappointing and it was less than expected. And I don't know about you, something I talk about with my therapist and my pastor. I have a problem managing expectations in my life. Maybe you do too. I've met some customers that I think have problems managing expectations in their life because their expectations are crazy sometimes. We're all going after these huge yields, and huge yields are possible, but they don't always happen, and they require a lot of work, and they require a lot of luck. Let's be honest about that. And we're not in charge of the weather. And when the weather goes your way and enables you to raise 300 bushel corn and 90 bushel soybeans, that wasn't you. That was the weather. Wasn't my seed either. It was the weather. What's number one on Dr. Belo's list of both crops, things that influence yield? The weather. And so we're not in charge of all of that. All we can do is control the controllables. And my list of stuff here is all the controllables. So let's dive into it. So been a lot of talk this year about tillage and residue management. I did vertical tillage on my farm on all my corn stalks going to soybeans for next year for the first time in my life. Honestly, I have been slow to embrace the fact that if you're going to do early planted soybeans and you're going to try to raise 80 bushel beans consistently, you need to be doing some tillage. Now, you don't need to get out the moldboard plow. I don't know that you need to rip every acre, although there are people that, are raising some really good soybeans. I have a colleague, their standard program for soybeans is, they spray a biological for enhanced stalk decomposition, they vertical till, and then they rip on the same acre. That's uber aggressive, raise some damn good beans. And whether or not a program like that would interest you, I don't have time to farm that way, just to be quite brutally honest with you. I have a hard time getting across my acres one time, let alone 3 times with 3 different operations. So that does not appeal to me. But his beans are a heck of a lot better than mine. So there's something to what they're doing. And basically when we talk about residue management, that could be tillage. That could be decomposition of residue. That could be nutrient cycling. And that could be influencing what kind of spring seed bed you have to plant into. And that spring seed bed that you're planting into, that's kind of the issue with planting soybeans early, especially if you're on lighter, lower organic matter, poorly drained, slow to warm up soils. If they're completely covered with heavy corn residue, which good corn makes a lot of residue, the better our corn gets, the more residue we're going to have to deal with. That's a stress on soybeans early in the season. It slows them down. You generally get an acceptable stand. It just takes a long time. And I often remind people, planting date is irrelevant. Now, you might think that sounds crazy because we all talk about the importance of planting date. The date you plant is irrelevant. The date your soybeans canopy, the date your soybeans start to flower, the number of days that they flower, the uniformity of your stand, none of those things are irrelevant. That's what we're trying to accomplish with earlier planting dates is earlier canopy development, more sunlight capture, early flowering, more days in reproductive growth stages. And none of that happens if it takes your soybeans 50 days to come up. So if you plant April 1st and your soybeans come up on May 10th, and you plant April 1st and your soybeans come up on April 15th, there's a big difference in yield potential between those two April 1st planting dates. So that is the issue that our residue is causing. It is delaying emergence of early planted soybeans, and that is reducing the yield potential of early planted soybeans because it's not the planting date that matters. It's the emergence date, it's the flowering date, it's the rate of canopy development. And so doing whatever we can do to keep the residue from negatively impacting, slowing down the growth of our soybeans. And there's other things we do that slow down the growth of our soybeans. Herbicides, for example, can slow down the growth of your soybeans. Certain seed treatments can slow down the growth of your soybeans. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't use them. I mean, obviously, we need our herbicides, and the best water hemp programs in the world, tend to slow down the growth of your soybeans. Some of our seed treatments that control nematodes and protect us from sudden death can slow down the growth of your soybeans. So that seems counterintuitive, and if you can use products that are just as effective at protecting your plants from diseases and nematodes and weeds that do not slow down the growth of your soybeans, you're probably going to prefer those. Now, people are going to argue about that are the products that tend to not slow your soybeans down, are they as good? Are they as effective? I could argue they're not, but there's a trade-off there. And that's up to you to decide which trade-off you want to make. So, second thing on my list, and I've kind of got these in chronological order a little bit, in my opinion. So if you're going to try to raise, let's say you want to raise some 100 bushel soybeans. So I don't know if you're thinking about this as I want to take one field and I want to try this stuff on one field and see what happens and see what I can do because I want to enter yield chasers or somebody else's yield contest, or do you just want to try to raise your game across your whole farming operation of the way you manage soybeans? So the second point here is kind of more geared towards the yield contest type mentality, and that is, well, what field do you pick to do this stuff in? So I would certainly say you've got historical yield data on your fields. You've got farms that tend to be good soybean farms. You've got farms that historically have not been good soybean farms. If you want to try to raise 90 bushel beans for the first time in your life, or if you've already done that and you want to raise a field of 100 bushel soybeans for the first time in your life, or if you're more like me and you'd be tickled to death to raise a field of 80 bushel soybeans, pick a field that usually raises good beans. That could be because of the soil type. That could be because of the fertility. It could be because of the cropping history. So the unfortunate thing about soybeans, I mean, if you're the Soybean Association, you want more acres of beans, you want more bushels of beans, you want more beans. Well, the easiest way to get more beans per acre is to raise less beans, because the more often you plant soybeans on your farm, the less they're going to yield. That is a biological, agronomic, undeniable fact that nobody has figured out how to change. So if you've got a field that 20 years ago had been continuous corn for as long as anybody could remember, and since then it's been in 50-50 corn soybean rotation, I would bet you that farm still today raises better soybeans than farms that have been 50-50 rotated for as long as Grandpa can remember. If you lengthen out your rotation, if you figure out how to raise wheat well enough that you want to raise wheat, if you like doing some corn on corn, if you raise, some specialty crops. I was with a guy just yesterday, a good customer in Mason County. He raises popcorn, and sometimes they'll do 2 years of popcorn, a year of regular corn on corn following popcorn, and then in that fourth year they'll do a year of beans, and then they'll go back to popcorn again. So he's only raising soybeans every 3 or 4 years in rotation on his farms. And that has, along with the use of some better cyst beans, has really, really, really enabled him to achieve some soybean yields that on his sandy soils he thought were impossible. See, we got a question from Merle here. Noticed last year that my early planted soybeans potted closer to the ground, hybrid characteristic for normal early planting. Okay, so Merle's question was, he noticed that his early planted soybeans potted closer to the ground. Now, I know Merle pretty well, and I know he actually planted some soybeans in March by hand. Are those the soybeans that you're referring to, Merle, or were these more normal commercial planted soybeans that you noticed were potting closer to the ground? Typically, potting height has to do with vegetative growth, population. If soybeans are thin, they're going to pod closer to the ground. If soybeans have, a little more space, they're going to pod closer to the ground. They're not going to get quite as tall. If soybeans are growing more slowly and they're not, the faster they grow, the longer the internode's going to stretch out. The higher the population is, the more shading occurs. Row spacing influences as well. 30-inch row beans will tend to pod lower than 15-inch row beans will. So I think, a little bit of what you saw could have been the artificialness of the way you planted them. Some of it could have been population. Planting date can influence that. And I guess and branching can influence that too. So, one thing that, if you've ever heard Alex Harrell speak, who's the current world yield record holder in soybeans, you might know that he plants his beans very, very thin. We're talking like 70,000 seed drop, and at those low populations, he gets some huge branches, and you get some very low branches. And occasionally that branch that's leaning away from you as you're combining, you might tend to slide over it instead of bringing it in. So sometimes some researchers that I know that have looked at really low populations in soybeans actually have a theory that the production level is the same at very low seeding rates, even maybe down to 40,000. The problem is harvestability. You've got so many pods down low that you're leaving a few bushel in the field. And when those really ultra low seeding rates yield less than a higher seeding rate, they have a theory that it might be because we're not getting all the beans in the combine. And so, yeah, obviously we have to have them potted high enough that that we can get them harvested. Although, if your beans are yielding 5 bushel more, and you're leaving 2 bushel in the field because they're too low to get them cut, you're still 3 bushel ahead. So, that's not the end of the world. But I would say that's the way I would explain that, Merle. So thanks for your question. So we already touched on crop rotation. That was my third thing on my list. And if you want to raise better beans, lengthening out your crop rotation is one of the most effective ways to do that. Now, you have to have other crops that you want to grow, or you have to be able to manage corn on corn. Not all of us want to manage corn on corn. That's riskier too. And if you feel you can raise consistently good corn on corn, then you're going to come out ahead, because your beans are going to absolutely be better. I get really frustrated with people that win a yield contest and they get asked to come speak at a conference, and they're talking about their fertility program and they're talking about their variety selection, And, some seed company is promoting that they're going to be there and obviously taking a lot of credit for the success that they had. And they talk about, go on and on about their fungicide program and their fertility, and they do this, they do that, and micronutrients and tissue testing, and there's all this secret sauce that goes into their success. And then you find out there hadn't been soybeans in this field for 20 years. It's like, well, that's cheating. There needs to be a separate yield contest category for 50-50 rotated beans, because if you're consistently beating 80 on 50-50 rotated beans, that's more impressive to me than somebody that raises 100 in a field that had beans in it for 20 years. So we got to be honest about that. If you can lengthen your rotation out, that's going to add bushels to your beans just like that, without even changing anything else in your management program. So let's talk fertility a little bit. So there's lots of ways you can go on fertility. There's lots of different opinions out there. There's lots of products you can use. You can use dry, you can use liquid, you can do fall, you can do spring, you can do foliar, you can do in crop, you can go crazy. You can go broke. There's no limit to what you can do with your fertility program. So when I say fertility, I'm talking primarily PK and sulfur. You can ask the question about what about nitrogen on high yielding soybeans, and in theory, once soybean yields get above 75 or 80, it's going to be difficult for them to find and make the amount of nitrogen that they need to produce that yield. Now, results of nitrogen fertilization on soybeans have been very sketchy. Yield responses range from no response to some response but it wasn't a positive ROI, to occasionally you see a response that was big enough that the ROI was positive on it. I don't really think nitrogen fertilization in soybeans is the secret to high yielding soybeans, but there are situations, especially on low organic matter soils, sandy soils, where the addition of nitrogen can help. Lots of arguments on what the right timing is, when to put it on, when to not put it on, what form to use. Foliar is not the solution. Not nitrogen is soybeans require. This is, some people don't really realize this. Soybeans require more nitrogen than corn. They just make enough of their own that we don't have to apply it. So the nitrogen that the soybeans require is coming from nitrogen fixation. Oh, which reminds me, I need to add another thing to my seed treatment list. Inoculant. Running out of room on the seed to put all the things you can put on in a seed treatment. That's coming up. So, if you've never done the math on how much P and K and sulfur is required for 100 bushel soybeans, do that exercise. It's humbling. If you're trying to raise 300 bushel corn and 100 bushel soybeans, you're probably not using enough fertilizer to do that. And you might not have enough base soil fertility to support that yield level. So fertility is important. pH is an important part of that. If you're trying to do it on a soil with a pH of 8 or a pH of 5, probably not going to happen for you, because you've got too many nutrient availability issues because your pH is jacked up. So try to get a pH in the mid 6s. I'd say low to mid 6s is where you want to be on a water pH, not buffer pH. You can use buffer pH, but the scale's different. Some people get confused on buffer pH. A buffer pH is a higher number. The buffer pH always makes it look like you don't need any lime, which is not true, because the scale for liming based on buffer pH is completely different than the scale for liming based on water pH. I don't think buffer pH is better than regular pH. You can use either one of them, but you got to realize they have a different scale. So you can't just switch to buffer pH and go, oh, cool, I don't need lime anymore. That's not the purpose of buffer pH. Some states, some fertility experts would prefer to use buffer pH. I think you can use either one. You just got to be using the appropriate scale for whichever one you choose to use. So that's my sermon on buffer pH. But and then we can get into micros. You can go on forever with micros. Just remember, with fertility, the vast majority of fertility that a plant is going to take up is going to come in with the water through the roots. And you need the fertility in the soil, not on the leaves. That doesn't mean that we can't do some foliar amendments. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can't, help a plant with foliarly. But when you talk to the Alex Harrells of the world and all those high yield guys, and they're putting stuff on through their pivots, and you're thinking, man, I wish I had a pivot so I could fertilize every day if I wanted to. That's not foliar fertility that they're putting on through the pivot. That's soil fertility, because it's going on the, it might land on the leaf, but it gets washed off the leaf and it goes into the soil, and it's getting into the plant through the roots. So God designed plants to eat through their roots, just like, he did not decide, my colleague, Jim Donnelly, he said, if you try to eat a hamburger by shoving it in your arm, you're going to starve to death. You can eat a hamburger by putting it in your mouth. You can't eat a hamburger by shoving it through your arm. And that might be a little bit, exaggeration for, the reason we need to fertilize the soil more than we need to fertilize the leaves. But, we can get some incremental gains with foliar stuff, but the bulk of it needs to get in through the roots, especially our macronutrients. I mean, nitrogen, for example, when a soybean plant needs, 4 pounds of nitrogen a day, putting 0.02 of a pound of it on the leaf, it's about 3 minutes worth of nitrogen for that plant. So not saying that there aren't benefits to those products, not saying there's not a place for them, but you cannot ignore your soil fertility. Everything starts with the soil. Get your soil right, get your fertility levels right. And that's one thing that I think I see pretty consistently is the guys who raise the best beans, they're doing all this stuff, but they also have really good soil tests. And in the current economic environment we're in, with the fertility costs we're in, I hear lots of people wanting to skimp on fertility. Be careful doing that. If your soil tests are already kind of shaky and you start skimping on stuff, that's going to catch up with you eventually. Now, I get it. You can't go broke putting fertilizer on. Well, you can, but you shouldn't. And so, we gotta be smart about it, but we also have to recognize that if you don't put on as much as your crop is removing, and you do that long enough, you're not going to be raising the same crop that you used to be raising. So that's just that's a biological, scientific, agronomic fact that is undeniable. We need to maintain good base soil fertility. So we need to figure out how to do that economically. All right, let's get to variety selection. I'm a seed guy. I'm a third of the way down my list, and I haven't even talked about how the secret to high yields is planting Asgrow soybeans, right? So I ran some data last night. I'm gonna have a few pictures here. Let's see, where is? Oh, that's going to be a fun one. That's going to challenge some people. Okay. Well, let's start with this one. So 33XF3. A lot of you listening would say 33XF3 is Asgrow's best soybean. We've got a lot of data that would not disagree with that. So this is what we call a yield stability analysis. I'll try to hold this the right way so you can kind of see it. So all those there's a lot on the page there. So you see the list of words there on the side. So it says head mean 76.1. So that means the yield, the average yield of 33XF3, and every blue dot is a plot location. This is 3 years worth of data from a geography that I like to pull data from. Down at the bottom it says environments 465. That if you count them, you can't count them because they're all bled together. There's 465 blue dots on there. That means that 33XF3 in this 3-year period, I'll get this figured out eventually. It's kind of weird. Hey, I'm holding that at like a 45-degree angle to make it look straight on the screen. Kind of freaking me out. So in those 465 plots over 3 years, the average yield of 33XF3 has been 76.1 bushel. The average yield of those 465 trials has been 74.3 bushel. So on average, 33XF3 has been about 2 bushel-ish better than everything else it's been compared to. That dashed vertical line that's called the crossover point is setting at 50. And what this data says is there's only 2 plots under 50 in this data set. So it's not a lot of data supporting this. But in both of those sub 50 bushel plots, 33XF3 was below average. So there's a bit of a trend here that they're not as good in a low yield environment. You can see where they have the biggest advantage versus everything else is setting at about 70. And as you go up to, and the highest yielding plot on this chart was about 105, which that's pretty cool to have a location that, that wasn't the plot average. That's what 33XF3 yielded at that plot. But well, I'll take that back. That actually would have been the yield level at the bottom is the average yield of the plot. So that far right dot, which is, I'm going to try to point to it. Whew, this is going to be tough. I really struggle with this. Okay, right there. So that dot, that plot averaged about 105 bushel. And in that plot, 33XF3 was 6 bushel better than the plot average. So that means it made about 111. That black line there is showing you that 33XF3 keeps getting better and better and better versus the competition up to about 75. And then it maintains and maybe slightly declines, but even clear out there at 100 bushel, it's still a couple bushel better than the average of the plot. So this is a bean that does well in high yield environments. And if you're going to pick a bean to put in a yield trial where you're trying to make 100 bushel, I would say your seed supplier should be able to show you data that shows you that, yes, this bean does well in a high yield environment. Let's pick on a different bean that is not a yield contest bean. So this is 30XF4. So you can see its sweet spot is between those two dashed lines. Its sweet spot in yield is between about 60 and 75. And in that range, that bean is better than average. In low yield environments, it drops off, pretty significantly. And in high yield environments, it can't keep up. So this is a bean that you don't want to use it on your worst bean fields. You don't want to use it on your best bean fields, but it's really healthy, stands really good, cuts pretty nice. And, honestly, there's a lot of acres of beans out there that yield between 60 and 75. And if that's what you're raising for soybeans, 30XF4 might be a good idea. But if you're trying to raise 100 bushel soybeans, I would say 30XF4 would not be a good idea. Now this was going to challenge some of you, especially in Northern Illinois. So Rachel customers, you might want to cover your eyes. Now, if Rachel's watching, she's probably afraid I'm going to shift into corn and start bragging about 6357. Rachel and I love to disagree on the value and purpose and usefulness of certain products. And we've got a new 111 that we're enjoying arguing about now. So it's fun to disagree with people you love sometimes. So 27XF3, love them or hate them, they're a high yielding, what. So the average yield of 27XF3 in all this data is 75.8. The average yield of everything else in this data is 73.3. So a couple bushel advantage. You can see they never get below average. Rachel would say, well, they do in my territory. And data from her territory is included in this. So if I would have excluded her data, man, this is probably driving you guys crazy. This is a good example of an exercise that would be better with our new format, which we are going to try to get back to the new format the next time Heather's able to be here, and we'll do a little better job. But 27XF3 is it's a monster high yielder, and it just keeps getting better and better and better as yield levels climb. So if you can manage the agronomic weaknesses, which are significant, of 27XF3, keep them standing, keep them healthy, they're a yielder, and that's what's kept them in the lineup. Because if they didn't sometimes do this, nobody would tolerate their difficult harvesting and their challenge standability and the fact they're kind of a white mold magnet. That's why they're still more popular going south than they are in the north. The north's got too much white mold, too much sudden death, too much lodging, and a little secret. Most of you know this if you know 27XF3. They're not a 2.7 either. They're probably closer to a 3.1 or a 3.2. So if you actually need a 2.7, you can't plant that one because it's not a 2.7. So, another example of a good bean that might be a good yield contest bean. So 38XF3, another one that just steadily climbs. And it has the biggest advantage versus other products at yield levels, up there around 100, which is where you want to be. So just a few examples. Here's one that's kind of interesting. And, this is a new product. So there's not as many data points on here. You can see, you can actually count all those dots. So this is our new 3.4. This bean has the biggest advantage over everything we've compared it to of any soybean we have, even more than 36XF4 and 33XF3. And you can see there that there's a whole bunch of, every time the dot is above the x-axis. So you remember what the x-axis is from math in junior high? That's the zero line. So every blue dot that's above the x-axis is a plot location where 34XF6 was better than the average of the plot. Every blue dot below the x-axis is where 36XF4 was not as good as the average of the plot. And you can see the vast majority of those blue dots are above the x-axis, and some of them are 10, 12, 14, 16 bushel above the x-axis. So this thing got some yield. But the data does indicate that, its best performance is in that 70, 75, 80, 85 bushel. By the time you're getting up to 95 bushel, it's a little better than average. It never goes below the line, which is good. So, this data would suggest that this is a good bean, whether you're raising 40 bushel beans or 100 bushel beans, which is nice. But it might not be as good at 100 bushel, maybe, kind of what the data is suggesting. We don't know that yet. Might not be as good as 100 bushel as some other products. So I could do this all day long with 40 different Asgrow beans, but we're not going to do that. There's just a little exercise just to show you, if you're trying to pick a bean to yield 100 bushel, maybe you want to look at yield data, a little differently. So planting date is huge, right? We've talked a lot about planting date, and everybody, well, not everybody, most people know that, earlier planted soybeans yield more. Now, how early is too early? It's also true that if you look at any good planting date study, and a good planting date study is going to have at least 4 or 5 different planting dates, the earliest one is rarely the best. Now, the earliest one is almost always better than the last one. So March planted soybeans typically are better than May planted soybeans, at least mid-May or later planted soybeans. But March planted soybeans usually not as good as something planted in April. Depends a little bit on where you are. Alex Harrell is going to probably plant beans in February, which is really good if you're in southern Georgia. Not as good if you're in central Illinois, although we've had people plant soybeans in Illinois in February, and they almost always come up and they almost always yield better than the state average, but they tend not to yield as good as beans that same person planted in, say early or mid-April. So, there's not, in my opinion, there is not a yield benefit to planting soybeans before April 10th. But there is a yield benefit to, well, let me say that differently. Soybeans planted before April 10th are rarely going to yield more than soybeans planted between April 10th and April 25th. April 10th to April 25th to me is kind of the sweet spot window for early planted soybeans. But, it is true that if you wait till April 10th to start planting, you may not be done by April 25th. And so it's okay to start planting soybeans in March. I just don't think your March planted soybeans are going to out yield your April planted soybeans on average. Anything can happen in any given field, in any given plot, or any given Sunday, as the movie would say. But on average, March planted soybeans are not going to beat April planted soybeans. Doesn't mean you can't start planting in March. I would just expect that something you plant maybe 10 days to 2 weeks after you start planting might actually end up being the best. But you can't plant them all on the best day. We don't even know what the best day is going to be. We're just trying to get them in early, get them off to a quick start. And so, when you've got good soil conditions and it's, late March or later, I'd say it's time to roll, especially if you're doing tillage. Now, if you're not doing any tillage, I'm not sure March soybeans are for you. The people that are planting soybeans in March and having success with that are not dyed-in-the-wool no-tillers, and they tend to be farming some pretty good ground. So black soil warms up a lot faster than that white crap that I farm. So you gotta keep that in mind too. Okay, population. So this is a big one. So Asgrow seed dealers, cover your ears here. Lance is gonna cut your sales. We'll be okay. We'll get more acres, less seed on each acre, with people having more success with Asgrow soybeans. So we put 140,000 seeds in a bag because that's what normally fits in a normal size bag. A couple companies do it differently than that, but 140 has kind of become the soybean industry standard for how many seeds we put in the bag. We used to, for you young'uns out there, we used to sell soybeans by weight, not by seed count. And back in those days, you could get yourself a really good deal on some beans if you look for the BBs, and you'd get a lot more seeds in a 50-pound bag if they were small. But we finally figured out how to do that better. So the math works out really good if you plant 140,000. That's 1 unit per acre. Even I can do that math. That's pretty simple. If you got an 80-acre field to plant, you're going to need about 80 bags of beans. Asgrow puts 40 units in a mini bulk bag. I know you hate the bags, but the math works out good. 240s making 80, 140,000, 2 mini bulk bags, plant your 80. So that's easy math, but it's more plants than you need. And this year, with the lodging that we had, I think a lot of people are maybe going to be willing to get serious about reducing seeding rate in soybeans next year. It is not necessary to have final stands of 130 or 140,000, even on light ground. Now, Alex Harrell's planting 70. We're not Alex Harrell. We're not raising 216 or 18 or whatever it is bushel soybeans. We're not irrigating, most of us. We're not in his system. So you can't necessarily just say, well, I'm gonna plant 70,000. That's probably not enough. That's going to cause more replanting. That's going to cause some weed control issues. We need more than that. But a final stand of 90 or 100 is more than plenty. And if you plant 110 or 120, you're probably going to end up with 90 or 100. Now, I will say this. I've got some growers that like to plant 120,000, but they don't think final stands of 100 are enough. Well, if you think you need a final stand of more than 100, you probably need to plant more than 120. So if you're going to get serious about reducing your seeding rate, you also have to get serious about being happy with thin stands of soybeans. And I would say a thin stand is anything less than 70. Some people would say a thin stand is anything less than 90. Some people would say a thin stand is anything less than 110. So whatever you call thin, whatever you call marginally acceptable, that's going to influence what your planting rate needs to be. Because if you lower your seeding rate and that just makes you replant more, that's not good. You'd have been better off to leave it at 140 than to do that. Now, I challenge people, normally planting an extra 10 or 20,000 isn't going to keep you from needing to replant. So people that are, well, I know I don't need 140, but that's my insurance, so I don't have to replant. That usually doesn't work. You're just wasting money on seed, and you're going to end up replanting anyway if you need to replant. So don't plant extra thinking that's going to keep you from replanting, because it's probably not. And if you want to get fancy, you can do variable rate scripting in soybeans, and then you can get really low in certain parts of the field. Your fields that beans get shoulder high and lodge in. I mean, those fields you need to, and you know what varieties do that too. I mean, I was picking on 27XF3 earlier. I don't think that bean ought to ever be planted thicker than 100,000. We got to get serious about lowering the seeding rate on these soybeans that have a tendency to lodge, and let them be 75,000 final stand. That's not bad. That's not a mistake. That's not a problem. That's probably closer to ideal. And so we just need to get real. We need to get serious about controlling population in soybeans, and that is the number one way to improve standability in soybeans. Better than burning, better than rolling, better than putting a PGR on them, more effective than any of those things. Lowering your seeding rate will absolutely improve the standability and improve the harvestability of your soybeans. I'm going to look on my phone here and see if a grower. There we go. Okay. So, that came out pretty close. I'm going to text this guy back real quick. Funny story. I had a customer that had a thin stand of beans this spring. They were really fretting about it. Was not a big field. Was not even on the road. You really couldn't. This field was tucked in behind a little town, and only these farmers and the people that lived, on the edge of this town even knew that bean field was there. So, if you got something embarrassing going on, at least it's nice. It's you can't see it from the road. And I think these guys were in this field every day, as it was coming up, just looking. Knew it was going to be thin. Could not decide if it was too thin to leave or if it needed to be replanted. And we spent quite a bit of time, and I was there a fraction of the time that they had spent there. They had been there a lot. And we spent about an hour talking and walking around in this field, and the worst places we could find were 50,000, and they were really small spots. The best we could find was maybe 90 or 100, and lots of places were 60, 70, 80. I'm going to say the field probably averaged somewhere between 70 and 80,000 final stand, which they were kind of sort of willing to be okay with. But the thin spots were just really, really troubling to them. They were worried about weed control. They were worried about yield, obviously worried about lots of things. And I knew this bean. I knew it was a big bean. I knew it was going to branch. They had nowhere out there where they had no beans. They had something everywhere. And the places where you could get down to 50,000 were really small spots, about the size of the table that I'm sitting at. And then they would get, gradually better. And I told them, I said, guys, I said, you can do what you want. If you want to replant it, we'll get you the seed. If these were my beans, I'd quit looking at them. I'd walk away and I'd let them be. They're going to be fine. And one of the guys, kind of jokingly asked me, he says, well, will they make 60? He says, if you think they'll make 60, we'll leave them. And I said, well, if we have a decent growing season, and if they were going to make 60 to begin with, I think they can still make 60 with the stand that you've got. And so they left them at their dealer's field day that's this summer. I had them bring me one of the big plants from one of the thin areas, and it was a monster bean. I mean, it probably had 300 pods on it. Stem was about that big around. It looked like a soybean tree, not a soybean plant. And that's what beans do when they're thin. And so we made a little wager in the field that morning. I said, guys, if because they were teasing me. I said, so are you guaranteeing 60 bushel beans? And I said, how about this? I said, if they don't make 60, I'll buy the steak. if they make 60, you buy the steak. And I hadn't heard from these guys in a while. I got a text from one of them just this week, actually. And his text, he says, well, you need to decide where we're taking you for your steak. It just made me smile, not because I won the bet, but because their beans did okay and they were happy with them. Now I did ask them. I was bold enough to ask them what they made. They actually only made 61. So they I barely won that bet. But Bear's going to buy the steak anyway, so I'm not going to make them buy me a steak. But I am looking forward, and I love making bets about eating steak because whether I win or lose, I'm eating steak, so I'm a winner either way. But we don't need high populations in soybeans. Thin beans are better than thick beans. You're better off to be on the thin side than you are on the thick, and that's what happens when we replant. When we replant, we go from a marginally thin stand to a too thick stand. You can't ever go from thin to perfect. You go from thin to too thick, and thin is better than too thick, and that's why even though crop insurance is paying you to do it, and even though the seed company is giving you seed to do it, you're hurting yourself by replanting stands of 70, 80, 90,000 in soybeans. Better off just to, I guess you can still, let's see, do you get to keep the crop insurance money if you don't replant? I don't know how that works. But anyway, your beans are probably going to yield better if you leave them alone. And 60 or 70,000, 50,000 plants is probably going to let a weed or two come through. 60 or 70,000 plants, as long as they're spaced well enough, I think is enough to give you good weed control. So I need to speed up here a little bit. So row spacing. So I can't share my row spacing data with you, but I can tell you that I was the guy in the combine when we harvested most of these acres, and just watching the yield monitor, there was definitely, I don't think there was an advantage to 15-inch rows. They were very, very similar. I want to dig into that data. There have been some people have had results that would kind of indicate that maybe for early planted, really high yielding soybeans, maybe 30-inch rows are actually doing better. Now, there's different schools of opinion on that. I think it could have something to do with branching, sunlight penetration, other things. If they are in fact better when you plant early and raise really high yielding soybeans, it's got to have something to do with branching and development. 30-inch row beans do tend to emerge a little quicker. They do tend to grow a little faster. They tend to flower a little earlier. So could be that. Could be something that we don't understand well. But there does not appear to be a yield penalty to 30-inch rows in early planted high yielding soybeans, especially on good ground. Now, when you start talking about lighter soils, later planting, different scenarios, lower yield levels, maybe not necessarily the case. But for years and years and years and years, we thought narrow row beans had an advantage over 30s. With early planted high yield beans, that does not appear to be the case. So I'm not telling you to, abandon your 15-inch rows. I do 15-inch rows. I kind of hate 30-inch row soybeans, to be honest with you. I did these trials hoping that the 15s would smoke them, and that did not happen. So I'm probably not switching to 30s, but we may start running both planters on soybeans and just sock all the beans in, some of them in 15s, some of them in 30s, and get the beans, all planted more timely by using both planters on soybeans. So that is something I'm considering. So seed treatment, you can actually pack so much on a seed treatment that you actually make the bean bigger. Fungicide, obviously, insecticide, obviously, biological products like, that could be some sort of growth regulator product, or it could be an inoculant, or it could be some sort of nutrient capture type product. Nematicides, nutritionals, you can actually put actual fertilizer on seed in a seed treatment. So, there's almost no end to what you can throw in a seed treatment. And I guess if you're trying to raise 100 bushel soybeans, I think it's kind of silly to skimp on seed treatment. Do you need everything you can buy on every seed? No, probably not. But, there's positive yield data on inoculants. There's definitely positive yield data on insecticides. There's positive yield data on, lots of things that you can add to a seed in a seed treatment. And obviously, if you're going to plant really early into cold soils, it's important to protect that seed. If you don't think fungicide seed treatments have any benefit, try planting some beans in March untreated and see what you get. When soybeans take 30 days plus to emerge, there is a huge benefit to fungicide seed treatment. Okay, so weed control. So obviously you can't have good yields without good weed control, but you don't want your weed control to be hindering your yield potential. So we want good enough weed control that we don't have weed competition, but we'd like to avoid crop injury. You need to avoid late post applications. You may say, oh, you guys say that late post spray that I did to clean up my field was going to hurt my yield. I don't think it did. Well, maybe it didn't hurt it, but it sure as heck didn't help it. These 6 water hemp plants that you killed were not going to hurt your yield, but the late off-label application of herbicide certainly might. So don't do that if you're trying to raise high-yielding soybeans, because it's just counterproductive. The early season injury that we sometimes see from our residuals, the soybeans really doing nothing at that point to determine yield, other than the importance of getting it out of the ground, getting it developed, getting your canopy developed, and getting it to flower. So if your pre-emergent herbicide is delaying flowering, delaying canopy development, that could indirectly be, reducing your yield potential. Ross has a question. Some seed treatments are slowing down growth. There you go. So he's naming names there, Ross. So we got Olivo, we got Saltro. I don't know. I don't know how to say that new one. I'm assuming that's Syngenta's new. I don't know if they're going to replace Saltro with that, or if it's a different SKU. So it is true that there are some seed treatments that can slow down the growth of soybeans. And if you don't have nematode issues and you don't have sudden death issues, and you're using a product that's going to slow the growth of your soybeans, and the problems that it can help are not a problem for you, it may not be net positive. And there's been a big shift in the marketplace, and you know this. There's been a big shift to seed treatments that do not slow down the growth of soybeans. Now, I can argue that in some cases those products are not as good at protecting the soybean, but they're also better at not slowing it down. And the vast majority of people have decided that, well, I'm willing to maybe give up a little bit of protection for faster growth. And so the seed treatments that are enabling faster growth have become more popular. I'm still using the one that slows growth because I'm stubborn. But, it's a fair point that we're trying to get stuff to grow faster. Why do I want to put something on seed that's going to slow it down? The reason you might want to do that is to protect it from cyst nematode and protect it from sudden death. If you feel there's other products that do just as good a job of protecting it and don't slow it down, that's probably what you're going to use. And that's what most people are doing. So at the end of the day, I don't think it makes enough difference to matter. But if it matters to you, doesn't matter what I say, do what you feel is right. Let's see. So we're talking about weed control. So now we're down to fungicide, insecticide, and one more harvest timing. So fungicide is absolutely a no-brainer in high yield soybean production. Anybody that's winning soybean yield contest is spraying fungicide about every 2 weeks from the time they flower through the rest of the growing season. Those guys put on a crazy amount of fungicide. You're not going to do that, but you need to, at a minimum, you need to do your R3 fungicide application. And there probably are situations where maybe an earlier or a later, or maybe more than one application would be a benefit. And I also think that we see, in corn, we definitely see a response to rate. where higher rates of fungicide are providing much better yield increases. I think we might see the same thing in soybeans. It might be a little harder to see in soybeans than it is in corn. I got cute 2 years ago and applied a 3/4 rate twice and raised some very disappointing soybeans doing that. So I guess be careful with multiple applications of low rates versus a higher rate, because I know in corn, I actually have data to prove this. One application of a high rate will oftentimes get you better yield than 2 applications of a low rate, even if the 2 applications of the low rate are more product in total, which is what's kind of crazy about that. So I did a trial a couple of years ago where 12 ounces of Delaro outperformed 8 followed by 8. So 12 actually beat 16. Can't legally put 16 on at one time. You're going to use 16. It's got to be 12 and 4, 8 and 8, 6 and 10. There's multiple ways to get to 16. You can't put 16 on at one time, but 12 at once out yielded 8 followed by 8. So I think there's a possibility that we would see some of those same things. Now, the rates are different for soybeans, so you don't want to put 12 ounces of Delaro or Delaro Complete on soybeans. That's too much juice for soybeans at one time. But I would say consider using the highest labeled rate of your fungicide in your soybeans, and also consider situations where you might want to make multiple applications. Again, if you're trying to raise 100 bushel soybeans, you might not want to do that on every acre. Insecticide, absolutely a benefit. There are situations where there's a bigger benefit to the insecticide foliar application than there is to the fungicide that's in the foliar application. Having the two together, increases your odds of something good happening. And I absolutely believe there are times other than R3 when our soybeans would benefit from an insecticide application. So I think there's oftentimes enough stink bug, bean leaf beetle, grasshoppers, green clover worm, long list of insects that like to feed on soybeans. I think there's a lot of situations in a lot of fields where there's enough pod feeding and late season leaf feeding going on that you could justify another application of just insecticide. You might not even need the fungicide with it on R4, R5 soybeans. So, the biggest reason, in my opinion, to consider an application in soybeans after later than R3, need to do the R3, and it could be R2, could be R4. That's fine. We call it R3. The biggest reason to consider doing something later than that, in addition, it's not in place of, you don't want to just wait till R5. Not a good idea. You need to do your R3. But the best reason to consider doing something in addition to the R3 would be insects rather than disease, at least in this part of the world. If you get into frog eye and other soybean diseases, that could change. If you're dealing with white mold, you need to consider doing an R1 application to protect yourself from white mold. And that also needs to be in addition to your R3. Now, if you do an R1, should your R3 maybe be more like R4, R4.5? That, maybe. And not a lot of research been done on that. But if you're going after white mold, R3 is not the time. And if you're going after white mold, you also need to use a product that has activity on white mold, because not all of them do. So you got to use the right product at the right time. And the right time for white mold is not R3. It's closer to R1. And then the last one. So, and this is probably one of the most difficult to manage of all, and that's harvest timing. We all know, especially when you're raising high yield soybeans. High yield soybeans are tough. High yield soybeans are rank. High yield soybeans suck up a lot of diesel fuel, and they're hard to cut. They're tough cutting beans. And the first day that they're 13%, they're probably so tough you can't even get through them. And how many of you have had the experience of chewy green stem, still got green leaves on them, smells like you're chopping silage when it comes out the back of the combine, and the grain's 8.5%, 9%, 10%. Drives you crazy, right? Well, the only way to avoid that scenario is to consider desiccating soybeans. And I don't know if there's anybody listening to me that's had any firsthand experience with that. I have not, to be honest with you. I've talked to people that do it. My former colleague, Chris Carlisle, he had some firsthand experience with it. We've had some researchers that have tested it. You can read about it in farm magazines. You could find somebody that's doing it, pick up the phone and talk to them. It requires a level of management that I don't know that I have the patience to do, quite honestly, because when you think about it, the timing is critical. If you do it too early, you're going to hurt your yield. If you do it too late, there's going to be no benefit as far as speeding up your harvest time. The idea of it is to kill the plant so that the plant is dry enough to harvest when the beans are 13, 14% the first time. Most of us who cut 13, 14% beans, it's the second or third or fourth or 10th time that grain has been 13 or 14% because of wetting and drying cycles. If you want to cut beans at 13 or 14% and be able to get through them easily, that's going to require desiccation, and the timing of that, the management of that is a real challenge. Because if you think about it, if you plant, a 2.7, a 3.0, a 3.3, a 3.6, and a 3.9, they're all going to be ready to desiccate at different times. And your April 5th planted beans and your April 20th planted beans and your May 5th planted beans are all going to be ready to desiccate at a different time. And even if they were all ready to desiccate at the same time, you don't want to desiccate 2,000 acres of soybeans, because that means you've got 2,000 acres of soybeans that all need harvested at the same time. So you have to do them in chunks and then harvest that way. Takes a lot of scouting. You need a field that's pretty uniform too. I mean, if your field's extremely variable and you've got soybean plants at varying stages of growth, you're going to be helping some plants, you're going to be hurting some plants. So more research needs to be done. It's really hard to scale it. I don't know that soybean desiccation is ever going to become a common practice, but it is absolutely a common practice of the people that are setting yield records in soybeans. Because if you can harvest beans the first day the grain is 14%, that's where your highest yield is going to come from. And the longer they set in the field, the worse the yield's going to get. So timely harvest, getting them out when the grain is at a higher grain moisture, is absolutely critical for maximum yields. And if you want to be able to do that, you're probably going to have to kill the plant somehow so that you can get it through the combine. So anyway, that's I got through the whole list. We're 7 minutes over, which that's not awful for a good conversation on high yield soybeans. So appreciate the questions that came in today. Appreciate your time. We'll be back in 2 weeks, which I didn't check that date. Heather's not here to save me. But whatever 2 weeks from today is, we'll have another episode of Ask the Agronomist. And then very proud, very happy to announce that, make sure I get the date right. I'm going to apologize here. I'm pulling up my calendar so I can know for sure. So the next Ask the Agronomist will be December 4th. And then on Tuesday, December 16th, I will be live from Champaign in Ermel Laboratory. And you might know what's coming. That's the home of Dr. Belo. So Dr. Belo has graciously agreed once again. We're going to keep our holiday tradition alive and have our season-ending final episode of Ask the Agronomist, which will be on December 16th. So that's a Tuesday. So we're moving off of a Thursday. Work better for Dr. Belo. So our last episode will be on a Tuesday, and that'll be the last episode for the fifth season. Believe it or not, I'm feeling like The Voice or something in my fifth season here. And then we'll be back for season 6, soon after the new year, and start her all up again. So we still haven't run out of things to talk about here on Ask the Agronomist. Thanks to you and thanks to your questions. Be back with you here in 2 weeks on December 4th, and then a little bit less than 2 weeks after that, because we're moving from a Thursday timing to a Tuesday timing. We'll be in Champaign live. It'll actually be a later start time as well on that, but we'll get an announcement out on that. It'll probably be like a 8 or 8:30 start time And we'll go for more than an hour. You know, doctor, it is absolutely impossible for Dr. Bilo and I to do what we want to do in less than an hour. So we'll start late. It'll be on a Tuesday. It'll be December 16th, and I guarantee you it will go longer than an hour. And that'll also be the most watched episode I've had all year, and we'll probably have the most questions of any episode I've had all year. Love having Dr. Bilo on with me, and feel proud and privileged to have the honor to have him as our co-host. So, thanks again. Everybody, stay safe. Hope you get the rest of your fall work done if you're not done, and enjoy Thanksgiving. We won't be back until after the holiday. Both my daughters are getting home from college for a few days for Thanksgiving, so I'm looking forward to seeing them. Hopefully, you're looking forward to seeing somebody over Thanksgiving as well. And enjoy the Thanksgiving feast. So take care.